I apologize for not being able to start right at 11 a.m. We had some technical difficulties with our live stream via YouTube, but we are here. So we are up and running on both live streams. Good morning to those of you who are coming in. We are on day 27 of our book talk of this particular book, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Mr. Tim Wise. So I'm speaking to two audiences, and so let me move my camera just a little bit. All right. Hope everybody is doing good. If you're doing well today, you can give some hearts as an indicator that you are happy and excited to be in the land of the living. So we have been talking about Tim Wise's experience as a white male. And welcome to our viewers on YouTube. You can feel free to chat in the group chat. I will see your messages as well. So we have been talking about race. We've been talking about white supremacy. We've been talking about white privilege, racism, and what do those things mean. And Tim Wise has given us his own personal experiences of white privilege. He's given us his own personal run-ins with white supremacists. And yesterday, and really most of this week, he's been talking about journalism bias, and he's also been talking about media portrayal of people of color. Really how things aren't always as they seem or are portrayed in terms of how people of color are reported on, especially in crisis arenas, in crisis events. So those have been some pretty powerful pieces that he has left us with. And now we continue on in our reading. Let's see, I believe today is going to be pretty short. Good morning. All right, conversation is limited through Periscope. You can only comment if I follow you back. So I try to do that so that we don't have all kinds of comments floating through as we are trying to focus on the reading. So let's go. Over the course of the next year, I would run regularly into youth groups, sometimes with churches and other times with schools, on their way to New Orleans to help with rebuilding efforts of Katrina, or on their way home from the same. Whenever possible, I would try to strike up conversations with a few of the students or their chaperones to find out what they'd be doing or had already done while there. If they were headed down, where would they be working and staying? With whom would they be meeting? What did they hope or expect to learn from the experience? If they had already completed their task, I would wonder the same things, only in past tense. Occasionally, the answers I received suggested a very high level of critical engagement, which was heartening. By this, I mean the persons who had organized the trip had recognized the importance of preparing the students for the experience by having pre-arrival conversations regarding racism, classism, the history of the city, and the political and cultural context within which the tragedy had occurred. In those cases, the volunteers were not simply going to New Orleans to get their help on or perform some version of perceived Christian duty. Rather, they were going to bear witness to inequality, learn from local leaders about their experiences, and work in real solidarity with the people struggling to rebuild the city. In other words, working with, not for. I was especially impressed by the students from Northfield Mount Hermon, a prep school in Massachusetts, whose preparation for their New Orleans service trip included an intensive class on the city, the storm, the role of race and economics in understanding the tragedy, taught by veteran English teacher Bob Cooley. In the case of Northfield, the school had enrolled a few students from New Orleans who had been displaced. And not just the kids from the private schools, but public schools as well. One who I met while there was serving as something of a mentor and co-teacher to his classmates and had clearly gained the respect of everyone on the campus for his wisdom and insights, despite the fact that he was basically their same age. But sadly, this kind of preparation was rare for the people I met either going to or coming from service trips to the city. In most cases, when I would ask about their plans or experiences, the answers I got from the volunteers and the adult mentors indicated very little critical thinking or understanding of race, class, and the role of both in this disaster. Most of the groups I met said they were going to be working or had worked, not in New Orleans itself, but rather in neighboring St. Bernard Parish, and specifically the community of Chalmette. Of those headed to New Orleans, most said they'd be working in Lakeview, the only wealthy and almost entirely white community hit hard by the flooding. I found this interesting and would always inquire as to how they got matched up with those communities as opposed to Lower Ninth Ward or Mid-City or New Orleans East, all of which were hard hit, mostly African American communities. Mostly they would say it was because the people who had organized the trips didn't know anyone from those black spaces, but had connections, be they with church pastors or civic leaders or even family members with the wider locales. Others said that they were honestly afraid to go into the Lower Ninth Ward because of all they had heard about the community in the media, most of it false, of course. Still others didn't really know why they were headed to places like Chalmette. Apparently the people whom they were working had simply matched them up with those communities. I found the placements in St. Bernard Parish especially interesting. On the one hand, there was no doubt that the parish, as it's known by locals, had been devastated by the flooding. Next to the Ninth Ward, literally, Chalmette was probably the hardest hit area in the metropolitan vicinity. But on the other hand, the fact that so many volunteers were sent there to help rebuild struck me as telling, given the racial dynamics of the area. Whereas the Ninth Ward was 93% black before the storm, Chalmette was the exact opposite, 93% white. More to the point, it was a community where more than 7 in 10 whites had voted for the neo-Nazi David Duke in the 1991 governor's race. And it was a place where, in the immediate wake of the flooding, parish officials had sought to prevent people of color from moving into the community by passing a blood relative renter law, restricting rental access to persons who were blood relatives of the landlords from whom they'd be renting. The purpose of the law, quite obviously, was to block blacks from returning to the area and settling in St. Bernard, since almost all the property owners in the parish were white. Now remember, one of the things that I like to tell people about these policies is these days racism is spelled Policy. So even as he points out here that they create this policy and there are others like it in other cities, because I have run into them. This one happens to be called the blood relative renters law. So if you think about that, if you're trying to move into an area, anybody who rents from you has to be of blood relation to you. Think about that. So think about people who get displaced, as he's talking about here, to another area, and they can't, they're really literally banned from renting because of provisions like that that are codified into your space or into your laws. So by putting that kind of restriction on your rental access, you don't have to say black people can't live in my neighborhood, because if everybody in the neighborhood is white and you're trying to rent from that person, notice the key word there is blood relative. So you can't even rent if you're not a blood relative. Think about that. That's very, very, very restrictive, and I can't possibly see how they actually got away with that. But as he's sharing, that was what was going on at the time. Did the volunteers know these things? Did they know that they'd be helping people who were actively advocating institutional racism and who in many cases supported a Nazi for governor? Especially if the cleanup groups were integrated, did they realize that the volunteers of color would be helping a community where it had been up to the local officials they couldn't have lived? In almost no instance had they heard about this. They were shocked. Local organizers of volunteer efforts had neglected to mention these details to the cleanup teams, mostly because they believed the racial tensions or inequities to be irrelevant. People were in need, they would say, and shouldn't be neglected because of their racial views. But shouldn't that have been left up to the volunteers? Didn't they deserve to know? Apparently not, according to some. The way in which racism of St. Bernard Whites was glossed over was amazing. At one point, the generally liberal Sierra Club gave a leadership award to Henry Jr. Rodriguez, the parish council president, because of his environmental record. This, despite his history of using racial epithets publicly and supporting the blood relative renter law right up until it was blocked by the courts. Even to white liberals, racism was a secondary issue, hardly worth discussing when compared to a politician's record on, in this case, wetlands restoration. What was most disturbing about the whitewashing of St. Bernard's racial dynamic was how implicated it had been in the tragedy that had transpired in the first place. After all, it was nothing if not ironic that those who had had the luxury of believing themselves superior to Black people ended up in the same boat as those they so feared and despised. What did it say that the same elites who hadn't cared much for the lives of Blacks in the lower ninth also hadn't cared enough of white lives in Chalmette to prioritize proper levee construction that would have protected them both? Perhaps if whites there hadn't been so busy scapegoating Black and brown folks for their misfortunes, they might have extended their hand to Blacks in the lower ninth ward, and together they could have marched on the Corps of Engineers on Baton Rouge or in Washington to demand a more people-centered set of budget priorities. But they hadn't, and now they all ended up with their stuff jacked, so to speak. Skin color had trumped solidarity. And for what? So we got to ask ourselves a question in light of the current climate, in light of the current political environment. Will skin color trump solidarity? I think about the election results and how 49% of the people stayed home and 25.6% of the people voted for racism, bigotry, xenophobia, misogyny, sexism, and 25.5% of the people voted for the other candidate, not saying that she was better by any means, but you got to ask yourself the question, those who are now marching, you got to ask them, number one, did you vote? And then the other question is, are you going to speak up beyond marching? Are you coming together in solidarity because you feel personally affronted by the choice of president-elect? Or are you coming together in solidarity recognizing that our country still has a color line problem that is not going to be solved overnight? These are some questions that we have to ask ourselves. We have to actually be realistic about solutions. We have to be realistic about how far invested we are in solidarity. We have to be realistic about, are you in this for the long haul? Because people of color have no choice but to be in it for the long haul because your color identifies you. So yeah, with all the things that are happening and going on, we want to make sure that if we are coming to a cause, that we are coming to it with an understanding that there's going to be some things required of us as we move forward, quote unquote, in solidarity. So let's continue reading. Believe it or not, we are almost done for today. Whether in St. Bernard Parish or New Orleans itself, the rhetoric of white victimhood was ubiquitous within months of Katrina. For a bunch who always seemed exasperated by the real claims of victimization coming from people of color, white folks sure had learned quickly how to play victim ourselves. This despite the relative lack of power held by black or brown, with which they could truly oppress whites as whites had oppressed them over the years. In a place like New Orleans, despite 30 years of black political leadership, by the time of Katrina, whites still controlled the reins of economic power. Even political power was often in the hands of whites who had been able to elect Ray Nagin as mayor, despite the majority of African Americans voting for his opponent. So think about that. Most people who understand racism understand that racism is first economic. It is the denial of resources. Okay? So what he's saying here is, and you're seeing it play out in our nation right now. The very people who love to shout, stop playing the victim, are now the ones who are claiming that they're the ones being victimized because people are protesting what they voted for. And, you know, they're actually saying that they feel victimized because people are protesting the coming injustices based on the staff that's being picked that is going to be in control of our country. So as he's saying here, even though African Americans voted against Ray Nagin as their mayor in New Orleans, he was still elected because money helped to put him in power, even though the majority of African Americans voted for his opponents. Even when people of color hold positions of power, their ability to oppress or in any way impinge upon the lives of whites is typically negligible. Though I had come to recognize this in New Orleans, it would become even clearer to me the first time I traveled to Bermuda. I visited this crown jewel of the dying but never fully deceased British Empire in the fall of 2005, invited in to discuss race and racism, issues that permeate much of what goes on in the Bermuda. Of course, to hear many whites there tell it, be they native-born Bermudians or expatriates from the UK, the US, or Canada, race is not an issue in Bermuda. In this island paradise, one is assured they have conquered the demons that still bedevil the lesser intellects in the States or in the lands around the globe. Bermuda, they say, is different. Indeed, in some ways it is. But in other ways, Bermuda is all too similar to the United States, and its history is intertwined with that of the United States, especially in regards to the history of white racial supremacy in the hemisphere. It was, after all, Captain Christopher Newport who sailed the largest of ships carrying whites, though they weren't called that yet, to what became Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, who then shipwrecked on Bermuda with Admiral George Somers in 1609, while returning to the colony with supplies from England. Newport, who I recently discovered is my 17th great-grandfather, by virtue of his seamanship, ultimately contributed directly to the initiation of North American genocide and white conquest, beginning at Jamestown. And his hurricane force landing on the Bermuda began the process by which Great Britain would come to hold this tiny Atlantic island as property of the empire. Newport, who had made his name as a pirate, raiding ships of other nations and delivering their riches to wealthy investors back home, carried with him on the shipwrecked vessel John Rolfe, who would later introduce export tobacco to the Americas, which development would then lead to the enslavement of Africans for the purpose of cultivating the cash crop. That neither Rolfe nor Newport died in the wreck has proven to be among the linchpin moments in history. Had they done so, rather than remaining alive and repairing their ship and sailing on to Jamestown, the colonists would likely have perished, and with them, the hopes for a permanent colonization of the Americas. Having failed to plant adequate crops, and without the arrival of the supplies expected from England, thanks to the shipwreck in Bermuda, the colonists in Jamestown were starving and dying in droves. Only Newport's arrival in 1610, almost a year after he was anticipated, had allowed for the colonization to be sustained. And had that initial experiment failed, as it would have without Newport, the Tensacomac Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan, would have likely had time to organize against future attempts to penetrate their indigenous land. Although I suppose I must be grateful for him having survived, since as a direct contributor to the genetic line from which I derive, I would literally not exist without him. The fact remains that his survival has been a decidedly mixed bag so far as persons of color are concerned. As for Bermuda, it is not only divided by race. Demographically, about 55% of the 65,000 persons there are Black. Roughly a third are white, and the rest are a mix of other groups of color, including a growing number of Asians. It is also divided by a vast gulf of perception. Blacks there believe race to be among the island's most vexing issues, while whites generally do not. And as with the United States, it is the Blacks who have a firmer grasp on reality, to say nothing of the history that has brought them to the place where they find themselves today. As with the United States, Bermuda was a nation whose early economy was largely built on the back of slave labor. And although slavery there was abolished in 1834, immediately upon emancipation, Blacks were confronted with laws restricting voting to those who didn't own sufficient property. As a result, less than 5% of votes for a century after the end of slavery would be cast by Blacks, despite them being a majority on the island for this entire period. Among the methods employed to dilute their vote and reinforce white racist rule was plural voting, whereby rich whites could buy up property in each precinct of the island and then vote in each place where they own land, as well as syndicate voting, where groups of rich whites could buy up property and then get home however many votes in a precinct as there were owners on the piece of the property. If 50 whites went in together on a piece of land, which none of them alone could have afforded, then they would suddenly find themselves possessing 50 votes in the giving precinct, whether they lived there or not. So although Blacks were the majority eligible voters in Bermuda, even by the early 1900s, these schemes intended to allow multiple votes by whites meant that the clear majority votes being cast would remain white votes well into the late 20th century. Wow. And we think our electoral college is jacked up. That is some skewed voting. Good God. As in the United States, hospitals, schools, churches, the civil service, military officer corps, theaters, restaurants, neighborhoods, hotels, and even graveyards were segregated by race for most of the nation's history. For most of these forms of formal institutional racism, legal change came only in the 1960s. As in the US, it was common practice throughout the 20th century for land to be confiscated from Black owners and communities to make way for commercial development benefiting whites, or even so as to develop a country club or private community, which would then practice real racial exclusivity in terms of membership or residency. Electorally, universal suffrage has only existed in Bermuda since the late 60s, with white Bermuda long having viewed Blacks as incapable of self-government. Indeed, the founder of the United Bermuda Party, which ruled the island from the 60s until 1998 when it was defeated by the majority Black Progressive Labor Party, famously argued against universal suffrage by claiming that it would be disastrous for the island until Black Bermudans had become sufficiently educated and disciplined. Equally troubling for Black opportunity in Bermuda has been a long-standing preference for foreign guest workers who are overwhelmingly white in housing and employment. Guest workers are given housing subsidies unavailable to locals and often procure jobs that are all but off limits to local Blacks as well. These preferences not only push Black Bermudians out of job opportunity, but also drive up the price of housing and other goods and services. But also, they distort market rates for land, making Bermuda an extremely expensive place to live. Black Bermudians are especially resentful of guest worker preference since their purpose has always been seen as a way to whiten the island. Though white elites insist that guest workers are needed to fill certain professional positions for which locals are unqualified, the claim fails to withstand even a moment of scrutiny. Most foreigners working on the land do not work in professional positions requiring a particular intense level of education or skill, and less than 2 in 10 have management level positions. That foreign workers are found in medium and semi-skilled jobs calls into question the extent to which the worker import is really filling skill gaps, as opposed to being the purpose of achieving a wider Bermuda. Interestingly, the large opportunity gaps on the island appear between natives, either Black or white, and not between Black natives and white foreigners. Although Black Bermudians with college degrees are roughly as likely to have management level jobs as white foreigners in the country, relative to white Bermudians, Blacks are not doing nearly as well. 43% of white Bermudians with college degrees have management level jobs, as opposed to only 28% of similarly educated Black Bermudians. Black Bermudians are 54% of all natives with college degrees, while whites are only 38%. Yet 60% of natives with top-level management jobs are white, and slightly less than a third are Black. While 38% of white Bermudians with college-level educations have positions in senior and executive management, only 22% of similarly educated Black Bermudians do. Despite the solid evidence of ongoing white hegemony in Bermuda, many whites there seem anxious about the way that political power, having been assumed by a Black-dominated party, may tilt the balance against them. Despite the advantages they have obtained and continue to enjoy, many whites in Bermuda seem convinced that they are the targets of reverse discrimination and that their victimization, if not in evidence, is never too far around the corner. While I was in Bermuda, a prime example of perceived white victimhood emerged. In the days leading up to my arrival, a controversy exploded when the premier at the time, Alex Scott, fired off an angry email regarding something said to him by a white conservative on the island, Tony Brannan. Brannan, who has a reputation for berating politicians for what he perceives as their incompetence and corruption, sent an email to the premier, in effect blaming him for Bermuda's sorry economic state and a decline in tourism. The premier, thinking he was sending a reply only to his close associates, apparently hit reply all to the message, letting loose with the impolitic and offensive remark that he was tired of getting flack from people who looked like Tony Brannan. Brannan naturally went to the press about the premier's remarks, and it had become something of a scandal by the time I arrived on the island that October. The premier, chastened by significant public backlash to his remarks, backpedaled, insisting that he hadn't meant the comment as a racial remark against Brannan or whites generally. Virtually no one believed him because, frankly, the claim of innocence was wholly unbelievable. The remark had obviously been about color. Since I was there at the time talking about race, the local press sought my opinion on the matter, as did individuals Black and white during my stay. To me, there seemed to be a couple of key issues, both of which spoke to the larger subject of institutional white privilege. On the one hand, I made clear that I thought the premier's comment had been inappropriate and offensive, but that was the easy part. In a larger sense, whites in Bermuda desperately needed to imagine themselves in the position of the premier, and especially as the head of a majority Black party. After all, there has been a long history in Bermuda of whites verbalizing their doubts that Blacks are capable of self-government. So against that background noise, for a white man like Brannon to criticize the premier by calling into question his competence would naturally cause alarm bells to go off in the ears of any black person who heard it. Though Brannon may well have meant nothing racial by his critique, for a black premier to have his competence questioned is to trigger a litany of negative stereotypes and call into question the extent to which the white person issuing the challenge may be offering it from behind the veil of prejudiced beliefs about blacks as a group. That whites could not understand this, and largely didn't when I explained it, was due almost entirely to privilege. If a white politician is criticized for being incompetent or not intelligent enough to run a country, for example, all of the different barbs about George W. Bush's intellect during his presidency, no white person would have to worry that the critique would be intended as a group slam against white people. We wouldn't have to wonder whether the individual white politician had somehow triggered, by virtue of his or her actions, a larger group stereotype that all whites were unintelligent as a whole, because there is no such negative stereotype when it comes to white intelligence. But stereotypes about black intelligence are common. So when a comment is made that could be perceived as stemming from that view, it is understandable that a black person on the receiving end of the critique might react in the way that seems hypersensitive. The larger social context didn't make Scott's comment acceptable, I explained, but it did allow us, provided we as whites were willing to consider it, to understand the way privilege and its opposite work. Even more significant than putting the comment in historical context, the most important aspect of the incident, to me at least, was Scott's apology and the fact that he felt compelled to issue it. The very fact that the premier had felt compelled to backpedal is public testimony to how little power he actually had in effective terms. After all, if power truly resided in his hands or the hands of the other blacks such as himself, they would be able to regularly insult white people, say terrible things about them, and never have to apologize at all. That reminds me of our current president-elect. Yeah, who's yet to apologize. Premier Scott would then have been in a position to say, in effect, screw Tony Brannon and everyone like him. But he couldn't, and that was the point. A black man was forced to apologize to white people for a simple comment, while whites still have never had to apologize for the centuries-long crimes of slavery, segregation, and white institutional racism. Alex Scott, despite holding power in Bermuda, had essentially no power to effectuate his biases against whites. Even were we to grant that he was a vicious anti-white bigot, the fact would remain that he would have been utterly impotent to do anything with those biases. He couldn't have expelled whites from Bermuda. He couldn't have taken away their right to vote. He couldn't have imposed discriminatory laws against them in terms of hiring or education. He couldn't have done any of the things that have been done by blacks in Bermuda over the years, political power notwithstanding. Totally dependent on tourist dollars, most of them spent by white tourists and white-dominated corporate investments, to say nothing of ultimate British control of the island, black politicians in Bermuda could be as racist as they like, bigoted as they like, but to no effect, except insofar as they might be able to hurt white people's feelings, and that was about it. It's also worth noting that the very same whites who were so incensed by his remarks had said nothing when the black premier of the more conservative and white-dominated party told blacks in 1989 to lower their voices regarding the issue of racism. In other words, telling black people to shut up is fine. Telling white people to do so makes you a racist. And so whites in Bermuda, as with the United States, insist that racism is no longer a barrier for blacks, despite the evidence of widespread disparities that have virtually no alternative explanation but racial discrimination, but has become one for them. A charge that takes white denial to a pinnacle of unrivaled in the annals of human irrationality. To avoid dealing with the legacy of white supremacy, we will change the subject, blame the victims, play the victim, and generally do anything to avoid confronting the truth that rests just in front of our eyes. Wow. So I think that pretty much sums up what's happening in America right now. We have changed the subject so many times. We have blamed the victim so many times, and now some are playing the victim and they're avoiding confronting the truth. However, this particular election has forced the hand of those who would ignore what has been going on. They can't ignore it anymore because it's right here out in the open and in your face. That concludes our reading for today. Believe it or not, we've got about, let's see, we've got about 3 more days of reading. So that means we will finish next Tuesday, right before the Thanksgiving holidays. And then we will come back after Thanksgiving with our next read. I want to show that to you for those who are interested in reading along with us. We're going to be reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. Awesome, awesome, awesome. New York Times bestseller. And it is going to be a Black man's perspective on race right here from the DMV, Baltimore area. So I hope that you got something out of today's reading today. Having left the United States and traveled myself, that was probably, as Tim Wise noted about Bermuda, that was actually the first time when I left the United States and traveled, that was the first time that I recognized that racism was not just a United States problem, that it was a world problem. And I actually saw it in Trinidad when I traveled to Trinidad. And that was the first time I realized that the race issue was not just Black and white, but depending on what country you go to, there are race issues there, or there are ethnicity issues there. And so, you know, that was something that was eye-opening for me to recognize, okay, the United States has a Black and white issue, to be sure. There are other issues, but that is the main one that has been shaping the United States. In Trinidad, excuse me, in Trinidad, the issue that I saw was the West Indian Trinidadians and the African or Afro-Trinidadians, that they had some race issues going on with each other. And I found it interesting because as a Black American traveling over there, it was like being able to be outside of whatever their racial confrontation was with each other. So as long as I spoke to people that were West Indian Trinidadians and they realized I was a Black American, their demeanor and their treatment of me was much different than the interaction I saw with them and Afro Trinidadians. So that was something that I noticed right off the bat, that there was racial tension there between those two parties. And of course, I've talked to other Trinidadians who are, you know, now living here in the US, and they, you know, told me that, yes, that is what you saw was correct. But we got to realize that this whole racism issue is not just a United States issue. You have it in South Africa, you have it in parts of Europe. I know with what's happening with the Brexit thing, you've got people over there telling Polish people to go back where they came from and different stuff like that. So it's not just a Black and white issue. It is that in the United States. But as you travel and get outside of the United States, you're going to realize that racial tension and racism exists within other groups besides America and the Black and white issue. Ours is just, for the most part, a little more complicated because from my research so far, I think we are the only ones that are really dealing with the chattel slavery issue, and the fact that blacks coming over here and then being dehumanized and then being bred as slaves is a uniquely American problem. So that concludes our reading for today. I hope you will come back and join us tomorrow for our last reading of the week, and then we will finish up on Tuesday of next week before Thanksgiving. Again, thank you for your time. I hope that you're having a great and wonderful day, and Lord willing, see you tomorrow at 11 a.m. All right, again, thank you for tuning in. I hope that you will join me again and that you will have a great and wonderful day. Take care.